April 4th, 2017. Khan Shaykhun, Idlib Province, Syria. The first light of day touched the rooftops of a broken town. Khan Shaykhun, once a quiet patch of countryside, now wore the scars of 6 years of civil war. Bullet holes pockmarked stone walls, rubble-lined alleyways. But life still stirred amid the ruins. Vendors opened stalls. Children emerged from sleeping mats, rubbing tired eyes. Mothers lit fires to cook tea and warm flatbread. Despite the war, despite the loss, the people of Khan Shaykhun endured. At 6:37 a.m., a sound sliced through the morning calm. A faint whistling, subtle, almost curious. For a moment, no one moved. Then came the thump. Not loud, not like the usual thunder of airstrikes or shelling. It was dull, unassuming, almost easy to miss. Then the screaming began. People clutched at their throats, coughing violently. Some collapsed where they stood. Others staggered into the streets, their skin pale, eyes wide with confusion and horror. Children began to convulse. Tiny bodies shook uncontrollably, foaming at the mouth. Mothers ran toward them, scooping them up, only to fall themselves, their limbs jerking, their eyes rolled back. No explosion, no fire, no rubble, just death, quiet, invisible, insidious. A fine mist lingered in the air. Unseen, it carried death in every breath. The sarin gas spread like a ghost through the town, slipping under doors, into lungs, into bloodstreams. It shut down the nervous system with terrifying speed. Victims couldn't scream. They couldn't cry. They suffocated in silence, muscles clenched, eyes bulging. Locals, unaware of the chemical nature of the attack, rushed to help. They tore open windows. They carried limp bodies into makeshift clinics. They tried to rinse children with bottled water. Many of the rescuers began coughing, then vomiting. Some collapsed moments later, joining the victims they tried to save. The white helmets, Syria's beleaguered first responders, arrived within minutes, their signature white hard hats bobbing through the chaos. They wore no protective suits. They had no gas masks. Some tied scarves around their faces, but it was useless. One volunteer, clutching a toddler in each arm, was seen falling to his knees, sobbing as the children stopped breathing in his hands. Then he, too, fell. The local hospital, already strained by months of warfare, was overwhelmed. Victims flooded in, limp, seizing, choking. There was no antidote, no time, no space. Nurses cried openly as they attempted mouth-to-mouth on infants who no longer responded. The air inside the building was tainted. Even there, death lingered. A second airstrike struck the medical center later that day, forcing patients and staff to flee into the streets. By sundown, the scale of the massacre was clear. Dozens of bodies lay wrapped in white sheets, more than 80 dead, at least 30 of them children. The survivors bore wounds that couldn't be photographed. Neurological damage, blindness, trauma etched into every breath. The sun dipped low over Khan Shaykhun, casting long shadows over the dead. The town was silent now. Not from peace, but from paralysis. That night, the first videos hit the internet. Footage from local journalists and survivors began spreading across social media. Unedited, raw, children foaming at the mouth, fathers wailing over lifeless sons, lines of small, pale bodies laid side by side like discarded dolls. Their skin looked waxy. Their eyes were open. The images were undeniable. The footage was picked up by international news outlets within hours. On televisions across Europe, Asia, and the United States, anchors delivered the news with tremors in their voices. Experts confirmed the symptoms: sarin gas, a banned nerve agent, one of the most horrifying weapons in existence, a weapon of mass destruction used again. At the United Nations, emergency meetings were called. The familiar dance began, statements of condemnation, demands for accountability, accusations and denials. Syrian state media blamed terrorist factions and fabrications. Russia claimed a rebel chemical weapons depot had been hit by accident. But the footage told a different story, one of precision, of intent. And in Washington, D.C., the images arrived on the desk of one man, President Donald J. Trump. He watched the footage in silence, not once, not twice, multiple times. The faces of dead children stared back from the screen, their mouths agape, their limbs twisted, their bodies lifeless in a world already too cruel. Later, aides would say Trump was unusually quiet that evening. He did not bluster, he did not tweet. He simply watched. That night, at a press conference, he stood at the podium and broke from his usual rhetoric. His voice was lower, slower, less scripted. A chemical attack, so horrific, against innocent people, including women, small children, and even beautiful babies. Their deaths was an affront to humanity. The words hung in the air. He added only one thing. These heinous actions by the Assad regime cannot be tolerated. The statement rippled through military channels. Meetings were held behind closed doors at the Pentagon. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Joseph Dunford, was briefed. Secretary of Defense James Mattis was summoned. Intelligence officers provided satellite imagery of the Shayrat Air Base, the launch point of the Syrian Su-22s suspected of dropping the gas. The debate was short. By dawn, USS Ross and USS Porter, Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, stationed in the eastern Mediterranean Sea, received their orders. Crews rushed to their stations, hatches locked, coordinates punched into fire control systems. The decks rumbled as 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles were programmed, armed, and primed. The attack was coming. But in Khan Shaykhun, there was no sense of justice, only grief. That night, the survivors buried their dead. Some did not have enough shrouds. Others could not identify loved ones. One mother screamed until her voice broke as they lowered 3 of her children into the ground. Smoke still lingered above the rooftops. It clung to the air like a curse, and the wind, soft and indifferent, carried with it the stench of chemicals and blood, a ghostly reminder that even after the bombs stopped falling, the dying wasn't done. Back in Washington, the halls of the White House were unusually quiet. The echoes of television anchors reporting the horror in Syria still clung to the air. In the Situation Room, surrounded by the brass of the U.S. military and his closest national security aides, President Donald J. Trump sat with a grim expression, his hands steepled in front of him. He was not known for silence, but the images from Khan Shaykhun had reached beneath the bluster. Something had shifted. "It was a horrible, horrible thing," he said finally, breaking the silence. "It crossed a lot of lines for me. No flourish, no political theater, just a sentence, one that carried weight." Around him, the room stirred to life. General Joseph Dunford, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, adjusted a folder. H.R. McMaster, national security advisor, leaned in. CIA Director Mike Pompeo laid a thick intelligence brief on the table. Secretary of Defense James Mattis, the warrior monk, taciturn and composed, spoke quietly, his voice firm. "We are confident," Mattis said. "This was sarin, weaponized, delivered by fixed-wing aircraft originating from Shayrat Air Base. No doubt." Trump's jaw clenched. He nodded slowly. 6 years of Syrian civil war had created countless red lines, crossed and ignored. But the use of chemical weapons, a weapon of mass murder banned for nearly a century, stood apart. It wasn't just war. It was extermination. And it had happened before. In 2013, the world watched as children suffocated in the Damascus suburb of Ghouta. Then, President Barack Obama had drawn a red line. Chemical weapons would mean consequences, but diplomacy prevailed. Russia brokered a deal. Syria supposedly surrendered its stockpile. No bombs fell. Trump had criticized that decision relentlessly on the campaign trail. Weakness, he called it. Appeasement. But now the same line had been crossed again, under his watch. The burden was no longer hypothetical. The choice was his. The pressure mounted. Across Washington, the apparatus of war began to stir. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency analyzed satellite photos of Shayrat Air Base, hardened aircraft shelters, munitions bunkers, command centers. NSA intercepts picked up Syrian air traffic chatter confirming the sortie that carried the gas. Military advisors outlined strike options, each more aggressive than the last. Mattis, always measured, spoke plainly. We can degrade their chemical capabilities, not eliminate, but send a message. McMaster added context. The Russians will protest, the Iranians will posture, but if we do nothing, this will happen again, and worse. Pompeo was blunt. Assad thinks we won't act. It's time to change that calculus. Trump sat in silence for several minutes, then gestured for the aides to leave him alone. The room cleared. He stared at the folder in front of him, filled with photos of Khan Shaykhun's dead. Children, pale and twisted. Fathers kneeling beside tiny shrouds. One image. A rescue worker holding two lifeless infants, his own face contorted in disbelief, sat atop the stack. Trump looked at it for a long time. No camera, no audience. Just a man faced with the weight of consequence. That evening, he hosted Chinese President Xi Jinping at Mar-a-Lago. Polite handshakes, diplomatic smiles. But beneath the surface, the decision had already been made. By April 6th, the order went out. 2 U.S. Navy destroyers, USS Porter and USS Ross, floated silently in the eastern Mediterranean Sea. Their hulls gleamed under the moonlight, but inside, crews moved with urgency. In the combat information centers, sailors inputted target coordinates into the Tomahawk land attack missile systems. The strike package included hangars, ammo depots, radar facilities, and air defense sites, a carefully tailored blow. Not too big to provoke open war, but not small enough to be ignored. 59 missiles. That was the number. In the Situation Room, Trump gave the final word. Do it. A red line had been crossed, and now something, finally, would cross back. At exactly 8:40 p.m. Eastern Time, April 6, 2017, the destroyers launched. One by one, the Tomahawk missiles roared into the night sky. Long white plumes trailed behind as they arced into the darkness, guided by GPS and terrain-matching software. They flew low, hugging the contours of the earth, silent hunters racing across borders towards Syria. Each one carried a 1,000-pound warhead, precision weapons designed not to terrorize, but to deliver judgment. Back in Washington, Trump watched the strike in real time. Military liaisons narrated as red lines traced paths on the digital map, the missiles closing in on Shayrat. In Syria, the night was quiet. Then came the thunder. Missiles struck with surgical fury. Aircraft shelters erupted in flames. Fuel depots ignited, sending fireballs skyward. Shockwaves shattered concrete. A command tower collapsed in on itself like a house of cards. Russian personnel, forewarned through a deconfliction channel, had evacuated. But the Syrian military was not so lucky. Fires raged across the base. Equipment was destroyed. Su-22 fighter bombers, the same model used in the Khan Shaykhun strike, were reduced to twisted husks. The message was unmistakable. Assad had unleashed poison gas on civilians. America had responded not with condemnation, but with fire. In the hours that followed, reactions poured in. Russia called it an act of aggression. Iran fumed. Assad's regime vowed vengeance, but its tone was shaken. The Syrian Foreign Ministry called the strike short-sighted and reckless, but behind closed doors, panic spread. For the first time in years, Damascus had been forced to take cover. At Mar-a-Lago, Trump informed President Xi of the strike after dessert, chocolate cake and cruise missiles, an unsettling pairing. She reportedly nodded, then asked for details. The Chinese leader said little, but what mattered had already happened. The United States had acted decisively. The world took notice. In the press room, Trump stepped up to a podium, this time with the confidence of a man who had crossed his own red line. He said the strike was in the vital national security interest of the United States to prevent the spread of chemical weapons. "We pray for the lives of the wounded and for the souls of those who have passed," he said. "We hope that as long as America stands for justice, then peace and harmony will, in the end, prevail." For a moment, the world held its breath. In Khan Shaykhun, the dead could not hear the thunder from Shayrat. But among the survivors, the ones who still coughed, who still twitched in sleep, who buried loved ones with bare hands, there was a flicker of something unexpected, not justice, not peace, but something close to acknowledgement, that someone had seen their suffering, that someone had answered. It wasn't enough. It never would be. But it was something. A red line had been crossed, and for once, someone crossed it back. April 6, 2017. The waters of the eastern Mediterranean shimmered black under the moonlight, deceptively calm. Below the surface, the engines of two American guided missile destroyers, USS Porter DDG-78 and USS Ross DDG-71, thrummed with restrained power. On their decks, the crews worked in disciplined silence, steeling themselves for what was to come. For the men aboard these ships, war didn't announce itself with music or speeches. It arrived in routines, checklists, and countdowns. Below deck, in the combat information centers, sailors sat hunched over radar screens and targeting consoles. Coordinates were confirmed. Flight paths double-checked. The 59 Tomahawk land attack missiles had already been loaded, their noses pointed skyward, waiting. Each one carried a half-ton warhead and over 1,000 miles of reach. Their targets had been selected with surgical precision. Aircraft shelters, fuel depots, command centers, all within Shayrat Air Base, the same base from which the Syrian regime had launched a sarin gas attack just 2 days earlier. The air inside the CIC was dry and electric. Far away, in the gilded halls of Mar-a-Lago, President Donald Trump sat across from Chinese President Xi Jinping. Polished crystal glasses clinked softly. The air carried the smell of roasted duck and chocolate cake. But Trump's thoughts were elsewhere. He had already made the call. The final word had been spoken. The launch sequence had begun. At precisely 8:40 p.m. Eastern Time, the command passed through the encrypted chain of military authority. The crew aboard the Porter and Ross received it in a simple message. Execute. There was no ceremony, only motion. Key switches flipped. Fingers hovered over launch initiators. And then, one by one, the Tomahawks roared to life. They burst from the ships with the force of demons unleashed, white flames carving trails across the dark sky. The Mediterranean lit up with man-made thunder as 59 missiles arced toward the Syrian coastline, traveling low and fast like intelligent predators. Designed to fly nap of the earth, they weaved over terrain, hugging hills and valleys, invisible to most radar systems. Across the ocean, in Syria, the night was quiet. Too quiet. Shayrat Air Base slept, nestled under a cold desert sky, its structures camouflaged and hardened, its aircraft tucked into revetments. But the silence would not last. Cameras from orbiting U.S. reconnaissance satellites and accompanying aircraft captured the moment of impact in chilling clarity. The first missile hit at precisely 3:42 a.m. local time. A hardened aircraft shelter detonated in a flash of orange and black. Seconds later, a second missile struck a munitions depot, igniting a chain reaction that blew ammunition sky-high, scattering flaming debris across the tarmac. Radar installations crumbled into twisted steel. Runways split open, Su-22 fighter jets, the very type that had dropped chemical death on civilians, were reduced to burning skeletons. The sky over Shayrat erupted in hellish fire. Syrian air defense units, caught off guard, scrambled to react. Sirens wailed, soldiers shouted. But it was too late. The missiles struck with near-perfect precision, spread out over 90 seconds of destruction. Out of 59 launched, 58 made it to their targets. The final one veered off course and fell harmlessly into the desert. A rare miss in a night of near-flawless execution. Smoke coiled skyward. Buildings burned. The base lay crippled, its offensive capability severely degraded. In less than 2 minutes, the United States had delivered a blow more decisive than 6 years of Security Council meetings, ceasefires, and resolutions ever had. Half a world away, the news broke fast. American news anchors cut into programming with urgent headlines. The Chiron read, "Breaking, U.S. launches strikes on Syria." Cameras panned to pundits scrambling for meaning. Was this a one-off strike? The start of a new war? A warning shot? But before anyone could speculate, the president appeared. Standing tall, suit-pressed, expression somber, Trump addressed the American people and the world from Mar-a-Lago. "Tonight I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched. It is in this vital national security interest of the United States to prevent and deter the spread and use of deadly chemical weapons." He didn't blink. The speech was short. Director. It was not wrapped in diplomatic garlands. It was a punch. He spoke of the beautiful babies killed in Khan Shaykhun, of the obligation of civilized nations to uphold international norms. He did not seek congressional approval. The Constitution's war-making powers were not discussed. There was no coalition, no UN mandate. This was unilateral. America had acted, and the message was unmistakable: cross this line, and we will respond. To Trump's supporters, the strike was a turning point, a bold move by a president unafraid to wield power. To critics, it was impulsive and legally questionable, a move made without regard for international law or long-term strategy. But none could deny the effect. The world was on notice. The United States had thrown a punch, and it had landed. In Damascus, the Assad regime scrambled to assess the damage. The state news agency claimed the strike had killed civilians, including children, but offered no evidence. Russian officials condemned the strike immediately. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov called it an act of aggression under a false pretext. The Russian military suspended its deconfliction hotline with the U.S., raising the specter of direct conflict in Syria's chaotic airspace. Iran echoed Moscow's outrage. Hezbollah vowed retaliation. The so-called Axis of Resistance accused Washington of imperial overreach, but for all their fury, they had been caught off guard. Their bluster for once rang hollow. And Europe, reaction was mixed but largely supportive. The UK, France, and Germany issued statements of cautious approval. NATO praised the measured response. Israel called it a moral move. But behind the applause and condemnation, questions began to simmer. What came next? Was this a single strike or the start of a broader campaign? Would the U.S. now pursue regime change in Syria, or was this symbolic justice, delivered once and done? And then there was the law. Some in Washington raised alarms. Senator Rand Paul called the strike unconstitutional. Senator Tim Kaine echoed him. The president needs congressional authorization for military action as required by the Constitution. Others shrugged it off. Senator John McCain praised the decision, calling it a clear signal that the United States will not tolerate the use of chemical weapons. Legal scholars debated the War Powers Resolution. Was this imminent threat? Was it self-defense? Or had America just bypassed international law again? But as the talking heads argued and the lawmakers postured, the missiles had already done their work. The runway at Shayrat was cratered, hangars blackened. Syrian pilots woke to find their planes destroyed, and Bashar al-Assad, for the first time in years, looked toward the skies with something that resembled fear. On the decks of the Porter and Ross, sailors watched the infrared footage of impact replayed in silence. No cheers, no high fives, just nods. The job was done. A red line had been drawn. It had been crossed. And now, for once, someone had drawn a line back, not in ink, not in words, but in fire. Echoes of fire. The world responded swiftly. Allies like the UK and France supported the move. Russia condemned it, warning of grave consequences. In Syria, the regime shrugged. Assad appeared on television days later, calm and dismissive. Shayrat was damaged but not destroyed. The message had been sent, but was it heard? For a while, the war continued its grim routine. Barrel bombs, airstrikes, sieges. But the international community began to shift. The taboo against chemical weapons had teeth again. Then, a year later, the nightmare returned. Douma, April 7, 2018. Douma, Eastern Ghouta. Night fell, but there was no peace. The final stronghold of Syrian rebels was under siege. Civilians huddled in basements. The rumble of shelling was constant. Then it came, the hiss of gas. Cylinders dropped from helicopters, leaking chlorine and possibly sarin. The result? Over 40 civilians died. Dozens more injured. Videos showed children being hosed down, lifeless bodies in homes, blue lips, and terrified eyes. Once again, the images circled the globe. Once again, they reached the White House. War Council President Trump, now a year into his administration, was furious. He tweeted, "Many dead, including women and children, in mindless chemical attack in Syria. President Putin, Russia, and Iran are responsible. Big price to pay." Behind closed doors, the Pentagon drew up battle plans. This time, the retaliation would be bigger, more coordinated. The United States reached out to its allies. British Prime Minister Theresa May and French President Emmanuel Macron agreed. A joint strike was necessary. The decision was made. At exactly 4 a.m. on April 14, 2018, Syrian time, the storm began. Strike 2. Operation Allied Force. At the stroke of dawn, waves of missiles and aircraft pierced Syrian airspace. The U.S. launched over 100 precision-guided missiles. B-1 bombers took off from Qatar. British Tornado jets fired Storm Shadows. French Rafales and Mirage 2000s launched Scalp missiles. Targets: a scientific research center in Damascus, a chemical weapons storage site near Homs, a command post, and suspected sarin stockpile Syrian air defenses fired blindly. Missiles lit up the sky like fireworks. The ground shook. The strikes were over in less than an hour. No U.S., British, or French casualties. The targets were destroyed. The message was clear. Aftershocks, Assad's forces declared victory, claiming their air defenses worked. Russia insisted no chemical weapons existed. But on the ground, the message was received. The U.S. emphasized it wasn't seeking regime change. But the world had been reminded chemical warfare would not go unpunished. President Trump, in a televised address, "We are prepared to sustain this response until the Syrian regime stops using prohibited chemical agents." Domestically, the strike drew mixed reactions. Some hailed it as necessary, others feared deeper entanglement in Syria's war, but one thing was clear: the red line was now real. War without end years passed. The Syrian war dragged on. Assad remained in power. Russia expanded its influence. ISIS collapsed, only to leave a vacuum. But chemical weapons were not used again on the same scale. The U.S.-led strikes, while limited, had drawn a boundary. In international law, the enforcement of norms is rare. But in those hours of April fire, the U.S., the U.K., and France had said, enough. The images of children gasping for air had sparked missiles from thousands of miles away. In a world often paralyzed by politics, it was an unusual moment of action. Reflections. Today, The Syria strikes of 2017 and 2018 remain controversial. Were they enough? Did they change the war? History may judge them as symbolic or as a necessary warning, but for the pilots who flew those missions, the decision-makers in the Situation Room, and the civilians who lived through the horror, it was real. Real targets, real consequences, real lives. As President Trump once said, "No child of God should ever suffer such horror." And for a moment, the world listened.